Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the 7th round of the Spilimbergo Open, which is being held in Italy. Now, the famous YouTuber and aspiring Grandmaster candidate, Levy Rozman, is playing. Now, after a very difficult loss in round number 6, today he finally has the white pieces once again, playing against a 2231 CM, and let's jump right into the action. So the game starts with the move knight to f3 from Levy. We get the move d5, and here Levy plays the move g3. After g3, we get the move g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, and Levy plays the move d4 here. Now, if Levy were to not play d4, say he were to castle, after e5, we get the classic big black center with the pawns on e5 and d5, and black is already doing quite well. So, Levy plays the move d4 to stop e5, and now we get the move c6. Levy castles, we get knight f6, and here Levy decides to play the move a4. Now, the idea behind a4 is that white wants to go c4 down the road, but if white plays c4 right away after, let's say, takes and queen c2, black can try to play this move b5, and now the pawns all guard each other very nicely. So when Levy goes a4, the idea is that here, let's just say black were to play a move like h6 just to illustrate the point. After c4, d takes c4, and knight to a3. Black no longer has this idea with b5 available, because after b5, takes, material is even, and now the c pawn is very weak on the c4 square. So, Levy's opponent plays the move a5, we get the move c4. The reasoning behind a5 here, as we'll see, is that black now is going to argue that because white has pushed his pawn to a4, it creates this gaping hole on b4, and black can create a bastion. So we get takes, knight a3, castles, knight c4. Now we get the move knight to e4 being played. Black tries to open up the diagonal. Additionally, black can move the knight to a6 and b4, or go for bishop e6 as well. Levy plays the move queen to c2, which temporarily attacks the knight on e4, but also reinforces this knight on c4, which can jump to a5, b6, or e5 down the road. We get the move knight to d6. Levy plays the move b3. The idea here is to support the knight on c4, but also white can now move the bishop to either b2 or a3, on top of being able to move it to the f4 square as well. Levy's opponent plays the move bishop f5. If black were to take on c4, by the way, white can potentially take with this pawn here and try to get a very big white center with e4 down the road. Say knight d7 and e4 here, for example, and now white has these three pawns all together. So, after b3, we get the move bishop to f5, Levy moves his queen to d2, and now we have the move bishop back to e6. Now, what Levy's opponent is doing here is he's trying to pose the question, what is white going to do with the knight, and then also with this pawn on b3 behind it. So Levy goes queen d3, and here we get the move knight a6, and this is one of the reasons that black played a5 early on, is that when white went a4 and black goes a5, now the knight is jumping to b4, and it's very cozy with this bastion. So Levy goes bishop to a3, trying to put pressure on the diagonal, and if black plays knight to b4, white can trade the bishop for the knight. Now keep in mind that in this position, Levy's opponent now has the two b's here on g7 and e6, aiming towards the white queen side, and as you'll tell from the computer evaluation, or the eval bar I should say, black is already a little bit better. So here we get the move knight c to d2, and now we have the move knight to f5, trying to pressure this pawn on d4. Now, in this position, if white can get e4, or for example, just to illustrate another point, if white can get something like this, with the rooks on d1 and c1, combined with this big white center, white is doing very well here, and white should have great chances to win the game. So ultimately, this comes down to what is going to happen on the central d and c and e files as well. These three files are going to dictate who is able to win the game. So here we get the move knight to f5, pressuring the pawn on d4. Levy goes e3, and now we get the very thematic move c5. Now, the reason that I say this is thematic is that this opening variation very strongly resembles the Grunfeld defense, and I won't go super deep in the weeds, but just to show you guys what I mean by that, there's this opening which is the Grunfeld defense, where the pawns come off on the d file, and down the road, black tries to play c5 and open up the scope for this long b on g7. So, back to the game, where were we? Right around here. c5 is very thematic. It is an open d-file. Black's trying to pressure the pawn on d4 and the rook on a1. Levy decides to play the move g4 here, and this is a move that is almost necessary. If white does not play g4 here, white actually can end up in a lot of trouble. You can't take the pawn, because then you do a Botez gambit, you hang the queen, and lose the game. If you don't do anything with the pawn, say you play rook c1 and c takes d4. Apparently after e4, white is okay, but let's just say you were to take on d4. Now after bishop takes d4, takes, and bishop b7, and rook to b8. The pawn on b3 is very weak, but on top of this pawn being super weak, black is also threatening to fork you with knight to e2 as well. So, we get the move g4 being played by Levy, and here his opponent makes a mistake with the move knight to d6. Now, this move is simply not the best move in the position. Knight to h6 would have been better because you pressure the pawn on g4 with the bishop and the knight, but more importantly, you keep this diagonal open, and you also can put pressure on the d file as well. So we get knight to d6, and now Levy correctly sacks the rook with pawn takes pawn, because after bishop takes rook and rook takes bishop, now black can potentially have some issues on the dark squares around the king. You're missing the fianchettoed bishop, and also white can try to put pressure on this long diagonal for his own light square b on g2. Game continues with knight c8, and now Levy plays the move queen to e4, creating the classic right triangle where he hits both the pawns at the same time, and we get the move bishop d5. Levy eats the juicer on b4, and now when we take a general look at the position, white has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Black has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can't do the arrows very well. I'm on my travel setup. But white now has 2 pawns and a knight in return for this rook on a8. And with no real open files for the 2 towers that black possesses here, white is in the driver's seat. So we get the move knight to a7. Levy plays move e4 here, and now we get the move bishop to c6. Computer actually prefers knight to c6 here, because when you go bishop c6, you'll notice the knight now really doesn't have any oxygen. It can't go to c6, the bishop's in the way, it can't really go to b5 because the pawn would capture, and if you ever go back to c8, for example here, you'll notice the knight still doesn't have any squares to move to because the pawn on c5 will capture it on the next turn. So the computer prefers knight to c6 here, and after queen c3, bishop e6, and b4, white is starting to expand on the queen side and is better, but it still is anyone's game because all of black's pieces are very active here. So, actually, one last point I want to make is after knight c6, if white eats the pawn on b7, now after rook b8, queen a6, and knight b4, let's just say you go queen e2 and bishop e6, white has 3 pawns on the queen side, but they're kind of blockaded here. You have weaknesses on g4 and b3. Black controls the file, and you can even go for knight d3 and knight f4 down the road, which is why the position is very unclear. So, we get bishop c6 instead. Levy plays the move queen to c3, intending to push p on the queen side and expand. We get the move queen c7, and here Levy plays this move knight e5. Now, this is actually a mistake here. b4 would have simply been a better move. Probably Levy figured after b4 there's something like rook f d8, and here if you go b5, black can sack the bishop, take here, and after queen b2, takes, and queen c5. Now black has 2 pawns and a rook, or actually I should say 1 pawn and a rook in return for the knight and the bishop, and it's very unclear. So Levy goes knight e5 instead. Still quite a logical move, trying to use this knight to attack the pawns and the bishop at the same time. Levy goes rook f d8, and now we get the move knight e to c4 here. These knights guard each other. The knight can also jump to b6, but white also has b4, b5 still in his back pocket. So we get the move queen to f4 here from Clendy, trying to target the pawns on g4 and e4, and also the pawn on f2 and the knight on d2. Here Levy plays move h3, trying to guard the pawn on g4 from being captured, and now we get the move rook to d7. Here Levy plays the move knight to e3. Now the reason Levy did this is that if you were to play knight b6, you actually get checkmated here after rook takes knight, you sack the rook, and after queen f2 and queen g2 is GG, why not? So, you can't go knight b6, but also if you play a move like b4, for example, now after rook a d8, black has the 2 towers stacked on the open file, and as I mentioned earlier, when you have a rook in return for, say, a knight or a bishop, knight and bishop and pawns, whatever it might be, you want the towers on an open file. In general, if you have the towers, also known as rooks, you want them on open lanes. That is when they become the most effective. So, Levy decides to go knight e3 here, and his plan is that now, after rook a d8, you can play his move rook to a2, guarding the knight on d2, and you want to play the move knight to d5 down the road. Now, I'm actually curious why Levy didn't play knight d5 right away, shutting down this open lane here. Probably he thought after takes, black can sack the rook, and after takes and rook d5, and knight to f3, knight c6, he probably didn't think he was much better here, and the computer actually agrees with that assessment. White is up a pawn, but you have the weak king side, you have a weak knight, you have a weak pawn on c5, and you can't push b4, plus black controls the only open file, which is the d file. So Levy goes rook a2 instead, and as you can tell from the valuation bar, he's starting to live a little bit on the edge now. We get rook to d3, queen to a5, but here we get this move rook 8 d7, which is not the best move. What black should have played here was a move queen to b8, guarding the knight, and also keeping an eye on the d file, but also this h2 square as well. Instead, we get rook to d7. Levy plays the move knight to d5 correctly. He splits the towers here. The towers are no longer connected, and the queen and the rook still guard the knight on d2 from being captured. So we get bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and here we have the move knight c6 being played. Now, this is a mistake, but at this point, I can't fault Clendy for playing this move, because here it's already a very tough position. Queen b8 is the best move according to computer, but it doesn't feel right because you're trying to attack here and going backwards when white has all these pawns going up the board. You just feel like you've done something wrong and you don't want to go backwards. So we get the move knight c6. Pawn takes knight, rook takes knight, and after takes, probably what Clendy is thinking here is he's going to get a checkmate. There is no way to guard this pawn on f2. You cannot guard this pawn, so surely you're fine. However, here Levy gets to go for a glorious meme sacrifice here. He sacks the queen for the rook, and he takes the pawn on b7. Now, what you'll notice here is that white has 4 pawns on the queen side going up the board. So even though white only has a bishop, with these 4 pawns and the fact that this pawn is 1 square away from queening, combined with the fact that the bishop guards it, means that Levy is pushing his p here, and he's actually winning in this position. So we get the move queen to d1 here, which is a mistake. Computer actually thinks that after queen to e1, if you play the move bishop to f1, there's queen to b4, c6, and now after this crazy move king to f8, black is actually still okay because you can't push this one because then you lose the pawns in the game. And if you go bishop g2 here, now I can check you. If you go up, I check you on e5. Eventually, you're going to have to go bishop f1, and after queen to b4, probably the best try is to go a5, but after king e8, a6, and queen b6, somehow the queen miraculously stops all the 3 pawns from getting to the end of the board. And in this position, if black gets his king to c7, black is actually winning here, even though you have this classic diamond hands formation with the pawns, because the king and the queen simply stop everything. So, very, very slippery endgame here. I think it's still probably a draw somewhere around this point if white goes bishop to a6, trying to push c7, because if you move over c7, bishop guards the pawn, and now you have the 2p, and you will win the game. So after bishop a6, black probably has to check, and now we end up in a situation very similar to the game where black is simply trying to check forever, and it should be a draw. Instead, we get the move queen to d1, and now Levy plays king to h2, and as you'll notice, there are no checks on the dark squares here, as the pawn on c5 covers the d6 square. So we get the move queen to d8, Levy goes b4, and here we get the move f5. Now at this point, it's very hard to be critical of any moves from either player, because at this point, Levy has one goal. Push p on the queen side. His opponent has to find some way to open up the king or find some checks, but Levy's plan is so simple that the onus is on black to find anything here. So we get the move f5, Levy plays the move a5, now we get queen to b8, king to g1, and here the move f takes g4 is played. Levy takes back, and now we get the move queen to e5. This is another mistake here, by the way. What's amazing about this endgame is that it really shows the power of the queen, because even though white has all these juicers running up the board here, if you play a move like h5, for example, after takes, you're probably thinking, well, white's winning here, because you just keep pushing p with a6, but black can now go queen to f4, and inevitably, there are simply too many checks here. If you try to hide, I just keep checking you forever, and if you block, I can check, and then check on f4, I force the king back, and we're in a situation where white can't win the game. So what you're seeing here in this position is that even though white has all the pawns going down the board, black has to find some way to rip open the protection around the white king, because if you can do that, you'll be able to save the game in spite of all these pawns on the queen side. Instead, we get to move queen to e5, and now Levy plays the move a6, which is a serious mistake. Now again, I'm not going to really say that it's a mistake. The computer says it's a mistake because apparently b5 is better. Don't ask me why it's better, because after a6, there's queen to e1, and now if you play the move bishop to f1, there's queen takes b4, and suddenly, I guess white's still probably winning here with bishop c4, king g7, and then c6, but this is already so dank and out there that I don't think any human is qualified to comment on these moves. So instead we get king to h2 from Levy, queen to e5, king g1 check, king to h2, and now we get the move queen e5. And here Levy decides to play the move king h3. Now this is a very serious mistake from Levy. He should have gone king back to g1, although this might have already been a threefold if he had done it. What he needed to do was to block with this bishop, as I mentioned before, and then go for this line with bishop c4 and c6. But again, very hard to go for this. Also, there's queen b6 here, which if you're looking at it, you might think, well, wait, now white can't push the pawns through, and so it would be a draw. So we get king to h3, but this does allow black to now play this move h5 here. Apparently queen c3 would be a draw, don't ask me why, but black goes h5, trying to rip open the protection around the king. Levy goes a7 here, we get takes, and now after the move queen to f5, you will notice the evaluation bar is saying that this is a draw. So if black checks correctly with the queen here, white cannot win the game in spite of the fact that you have these two p's that are very close to queen. They're literally one square away. So Levy goes king g3, we get queen to e5, f4 is played, and here Levy's opponent makes a huge mistake with this move queen to e3. Now in this position, if black were to play the move queen to e1, the game will end in a draw, because if white tries to hide the king on h3, there's queen to e3 check. If you go back, I take the pawn, and now after king g1 and queen to c1, this is simply a draw. You can't dodge the checks. And if you choose to play the move king to f3 here, now black can play the move queen to d1 check. Not an obvious move, by the way. And after king to e4 and queen to e2, king d4, queen d2, king c4, queen to e2. Actually, wait, I think it's queen... Is it queen b2 is a draw? Apparently queen d2 loses to king e5. Don't ask me why. But after queen to b2, the game should be a draw. Now, with 1 minute on the clock, and at this level, I think there's zero chance to save it. Frankly, I think even if I were playing this or Magnus were playing with the black pieces, very, very unlikely that we'd be able to save this position because a lot of these checks are simply counterintuitive. So, this would have led to a draw after queen d1. Let's just say king g3, queen e1 is also a draw. If you go back to f2, there's queen to d2, and so forth, and white can't dodge the checks. Instead, Levy's opponent plays queen to e3, and now we all breathe a heavy sigh of relief because now Levy can block with the bishop on f3, and when black tries to check on g1, you go king to h3, and after queen to f1, you have bishop g2 here, and after queen to d3, the king hides safely on the h2 square. Now there are no checks left, and with a 2p on the 7th rank, Levy is going to push his p to the 8th rank, get a queen, and win the game. We get the move queen to c3, which I don't know if this move was actually played or not before Clendy resigns this game, but a wild and wacky finish in this game. This game really illustrates why chess can be so beautiful at times, because due to this massive material imbalance where white has these 4 pawns rolling up the board, you see a great and exciting finish. There's so many resources, so many study-like situations here where black could save the game. For Levy, he's just trying to push the pawns up the board. It's all about the 4 pawns. The bishop really doesn't do a whole lot other than guarding the pawn on g2, but nonetheless, it's a fascinating game, and this is why chess is such a great game at the end of the day. When you see games like this where there's so many chances, it's so back and forth, and I honestly have to say, I can't really think of a game that anyone that I've seen has played, including myself, where you've had this situation where someone has 4 pawns on one side of the board combined with a bishop, and is trying to win the game. I literally can't think of an example of anything like this. It's just that unique. And that really speaks to how great chess is at the end of the day. So, Levy gets a big win in this game. He wins his 7th round. I believe that he is now 4.5 points out of 7. He's still losing some rating points. Tomorrow, I believe they play the final 2 rounds, round 8 and 9. I could be wrong on that, but I think it's the final 2 rounds. Levy, if he can win the final 2 games, will gain a few ranking points. He's obviously not going to get a Grandmaster. Norman, his performance is nowhere near a Grandmaster level, but it's still good to see Levy playing well in spite of what happened in the previous round. So, on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the 7th round of the Spilimbergo Open, which is being held in Italy. If you are not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with a recap from day 2 of the St. Louis Rapid and Blitz, which I played in a little bit later on, and that'll be that. So hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you soon. Bye!